pick up a couple of themes, actually. And first of all, I want to thank Chris for this. We first met in Fremantle in November of 2012 at that particular big Indian Ocean Jamboree. Fremantle's a place I really like and have been to a number of times. And then he came down, and then I organized an Indian Ocean set of lectures in my last quarter of teaching at UCLA a year ago. And Chris came down, he had just arrived, so I'm happy to be able to be here. When he was talking at the beginning, doing his introduction, he mentioned several things that are relevant to what I'm going to say, just sort of as background. One is periodization. Since I'm going to be talking about, at least as a take-up, shameless self-promotion, my Indian Ocean world history, 7,000 years and about 150 pages of text. One of the real questions is, how do you break it up? I mean, how do you periodize? And that's a fundamental historian's question. It has nothing to do with stratigraphy or the kinds of things that archaeologists worry about, or chemical dating or anything. The other thing he mentioned was methodology, and although he said he's kind of backed away from spending too much time, in fact, that's one of the things he asked me to talk about. And so most of my paper is, in fact, about methodology and why, when one is based in one discipline, and hopefully well-trained in its disciplines, when you start incorporating other disciplines' work, you can't just pick and choose. You have to know where it's, what those, you at least know where to go to see the correct methodological presentation of material. You can't. So that's something. And then the other thing is that he said, well, the focus here is on historical archaeology, and Paul basically talked about that too, post-1500. But in point of fact, most of my examples are going to be from the earlier period, because that's where most of the archaeological work has been. And I'm, as John Saul once said to me in Tanzania, we enter here upon troubled waters. I'm going to be talking about archaeologists' work, and we'll see what you think about this. So one of the things in writing this book is I integrate all kinds of stuff. And so this paper actually gives me a great opportunity to, and I came without slides, so it gives me an opportunity to at least talk about some of the problems that I faced and which show up in various ways, because this series that Oxford publishes in this, the Oxford New World History, they don't want me, the only notes they want are for direct quotes, and so that's what I've got. And then there's readings at the end, but it's not the usual kind of thing filled with footnotes. The other thing is that, and the one thing I'll say about periodization is how I approach this, is I don't, though this is in a world history text, and when I taught it at UCLA, it was under a rubric of world history, I don't consider myself a world historian, even though I write about a big world history thing. So unlike Philippe Beaujard, who is a very dear friend, and has just published, a massive 2 volumes, beautifully produced by Armand Colin on the Indian Ocean world, I don't adhere to any particular theoretical, I'm certainly not a post-Wallersteinian world systems type. So for me, it was I basically adopt two things mark it: a chronological approach, which I then had to periodize, but also I wanted to be very clear, both to include Eastern Africa, which is often excluded. I mean, Kirti Chowdhury's work is the best example of that. But I also didn't want to privilege it. And so the real trick for me was learning about, and as I'd been for a number of years, teaching myself about the trade from South China, a lot more about insular Indonesia, insular Southeast Asia, things like that, so that there's some balance, and that when you move from chapter to chapter, something that was talked about in the previous chapter didn't just disappear until 2 chapters later. And so that's the methodology of writing. So there's a whole laundry list of kinds of evidence I used, some of which are listed on the blurb in the back of the book. But Krish asked me specifically in an email, he said, how do we do, this is a quote, how do we do multidisciplinary research from the historical perspective? What has been done in the region within a historical framework? And how can this be integrated for informing on archaeological studies? And so this was sort of and then I go on to say, if we're looking for an agenda for historical archaeology, these are things we need to think about. So I begin the paper, what I hope I won't summarize the whole thing, but I begin with a really important paper that my colleague, dear colleague, Chris Arrett, wrote for linguists that appeared in the African Archaeological Review 2 years ago, called Linguistic Archaeology. And I just want to quote some of it because it bears upon what I then go on to say. He says, linguistic evidence is hard evidence. Let us qualify that assertion. Linguistic evidence, properly situated in a systematic phonological reconstruction, is hard evidence. An archaeologist may say, I can't hold these words in my hand. I cannot subject them to tests of material science. How then is linguistic evidence hard evidence? And then he goes on in his usual way, kind of overwhelming us with examples, in this case of donkey, the use of donkey in the ancestral Proto-Eastern Cushitic to make his point, as he's done all throughout his work. Towards the end of his detailed reconstruction, he addresses the question of, he says, what every scholar of the past should know. And he reduces to 2 lessons, which I think are specifically designed for archaeologists. He said, the first lesson relates to the nature of linguistic evidence and argument. Linguistics is a separate, capacious source of evidence about history and culture of earlier times, with its own well-developed body of theory and practice. Its evidence is subject to rigorous validation. Its findings stand on their own. They are not some impressionistic adjuncts to other kinds of historical argument. We do not get to pick and choose or to engage in special pleading to make the linguistic evidence fit our notions. And I think we all know that the things we read are full of that kind of stuff. And then he ends, he gives an example of a case in European archaeology where some mistakes were made that way. And he gives an example of how not to do it, picking on some of the work of Roger Blanche, who I'll mention later. So what Arrett argues for linguistics applies equally to every other kind of disciplinary evidence that the historian or archaeologist seeks to use in her work. But of course we have to rely on the trustworthiness of our colleagues. I mean, how else could we exist? Nor can we all expect to master every methodology for the sources we wish to apply to our own work. But his injunction cautions us against engaging either in lazy scholarship or wishful thinking. So seizing upon a piece of evidence to support an interpretation because it fits our sense of or insistence upon what must have been so runs the risk of undermining our effort to achieve an interdisciplinary scholarship, whether we are archaeologists or historians. And the other thing is that if you begin by having made such an assumption, that assumption then sometimes forms the foundation for building other assumptions. And I think we've all seen very shaky hypotheses about one thing or another in the Indian Ocean world, which, au fond, you look at the bottom, are based on some hairy interpretation of something. And I think that's a real problem that we all face. And I'll give one example here. There is, for example, some of you may know this book. I was clued to it by one of our former graduate students. A key element of Charles and Francis Pierce's convoluted arguments about the settlement of Madagascar in the 2nd millennium BCE is their mistaken belief in the existence of an ancient cinnamon route, which is based on earlier classical work, and, quote, a direct route from the Spice Islands to Rapta. If so, they say, it would probably also have been the trigger for the initial colonization of Madagascar. Here I'll only note that there's no mention in the Periplus of cinnamon being traded to Rapta. And if you look at the one place where there's been serious archaeological work, which is in Baraniki, there's not a single reference to cinnamon. So, and I'll come back to the Periplus in a little bit. Now, the example that I spent a lot of time on, the first part of the paper, is the settlement of Madagascar. Because time is a factor, I'm not going to give you the basic run-through of stuff that a number of you will know about how, biozoological, all kinds of genetic work and everything. The bottom line is that we still don't know exactly how or exactly when this began. We have a good idea of the beginning of let's say the first half millennium of the current era. But I'm not going to do that. I think what I want to do here is to, in the spread of the wind pattern of single out canoes and chickens and Zanzibar, all this sort of stuff, and food crops. But I think what I want to spend a little time on, and you'll read from the paper here, is, let's say, a nagging question. Once you get to that and understand that Madagascar is peopled by an Afro-Asian culture, which incorporates both Bantu and Austronesian examples and evidence. It's genetic, linguistic, all kinds of stuff. A nagging question that continues to vex scholars in the peopling of Madagascar is whether or not there was a pre-Proto-Malagasy population on the Great Island. Salafa Radrianja and Stephen Ellis, who have the most recent and very good short history of Madagascar, neatly summarize this scattered evidence and suggest that at best they reflect activity by transient sailors who stopped over on its shores. In 2007, Roger Blanche, who is always a provocative multidisciplinary scholar, but not without his methodological critics, suggested an earlier chronology and a new interpretation for the settlement of the island, based mainly on paleo-zoogeographical evidence. He concludes his paper in the following terms. Quote, conventional narratives of the occupation of Madagascar have been increasingly at odds with new indications from a variety of disciplines and fresh approaches required. The model advanced here attempts to account for these, but only more intensive archaeology in targeted sites will provide the type of physical evidence required to refute or enrich these hypotheses. Now, it would seem that an initial response to this is this remarkable paper that's co-authored by a group of well-known and respected archaeologists of Madagascar who make the case, and the Comoros, that, quote, our evidence shows that foragers with a microlithic technology were active in Madagascar long before the arrival of farmers and herders and before many late Holocene faunal extinctions, suggesting a date as early as 2000 BC. Now, I'm not, the whole literature on faunal extinction is, not what I'm going to get into here. But according to their report, if you haven't seen it, it appears in the PNS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year. According to their report, they discovered tools of chert and obsidian in a small rock shelter at Ambuipos, near Voimar and overlooking the Bay of Iharan. These tools, quote, are certainly a result of human action, they say. Moreover, quote, even though a small sample of tiny items, they are clearly a stone tool assemblage created and used by people, end quote. This team also identified some bits of pottery and some wood charcoal that, quote, suggest the stone tool makers of Ambuipos were contemporary with the earliest iron-using villagers of Voimar. They then linked this site to a later 11th and 14th century site at Lakatani Anja, which is near Ansegurama, with its own small stone tool industry created by people, they say. There's some important ceramics and other artifacts and some animal bones for this site. In their discussion, they contend that, quote, the stone tools from Ambuiposa and Lakatane Anja are unlike anything reported from Madagascar and are indicative of intermittent occupation by small groups engaged in foraging. Finally, there are two OSL. You will know what that, but I had to look it up to see that it means optically stimulated luminescence, dated sediment samples to roughly 1460 to 2370 BCE, which the authors state, quote, are in correct stratigraphic order with respect to the later period, the 11th to 14th centuries, the radiocarbon dates for the site. And then they acknowledge the small size of their samples, yet they suggest, quote, they resemble those known from southern and eastern Africa, southern Arabia, and South Asia, and are unlike those from Southeast Asia. So then they link this to arguments about Holocene extinctions, and they argue our unique evidence shows that extinctions occurred long after human arrival on the island, that is, long after 2000 BC. Finally, they contend that the view that Madagascar's history can be sharply divided by the arrival of humans between an undisturbed Eden, I don't know how many historians believe in an undisturbed Eden, but still, and anthropogenic chaos is no longer tenable, even though they cannot yet establish, quote, when foragers first arrived in Madagascar. Then I write, now what is a historian to make of this new evidence? We're sort of at the mercy of these guys. So I've been working with a number of colleagues on food crop exchanges across the Indian Ocean, some of which you get a paper at Fremantle, and we've been doing some other stuff. And we've been both excited by the possibility and cautious about the reliability of this dating. One of the people who kind of chimed in, I don't know who got him there, but Simon Herbal, who I don't know, but he's the director of the Center for Archaeological Research at the ANU in Canberra, commented in an email to a group of us, which I thought very wisely. He said, the evidence from the stone tools is interesting, but given the sedimentary context, sandy, it is entirely possible that the cultural material has been distributed downwards by bioturbation, and thus is not dated accurately by the OSL determinations. I know there's a turbation center right around the corner here. That was interesting. It was around, he goes on, almost exactly such a case that the argument about 2,000-year-old rats in New Zealand resolved, now well and truly rejected on the basis of many tightly constrained C14 dates at a number of sites and reassessment of sediment context. Anderson in several papers, not having met you, but I've now read these papers, and Wilmhurst et al., in which you're also an author, and he attached that, which is how I then followed up, showed eventually that the 2,000-year-old dates in intact strata were correct, but the rat bones had been displaced and were less than 1,000 years old. This kind of situation is not unexpected, he says, in coastal rock shelters, where burrowing animals and birds, especially petrels and shearwaters, seek nesting sites. It seems that it will be even more difficult to test this in Madagascar because there is nothing suitable for radiocarbon dating in association with the chert flakes in the lower levels. But that alone should raise a flag of caution when interpreting this data. Much work is to be done. And this strikes me being an exact, this picks up exactly in what Chris said about linguistic evidence. You could say, great, now I'll rewrite my text or my lectures and I'll talk about people came to Madagascar 2,000 years earlier than we thought. And what, you do have to be careful. But this is clearly a beautiful example of the kind of caution that you have to use, no matter where you stand, in using sources from disciplines in which you're not professionally trained. Nevertheless, it's very exciting. And as Rajendra and Ellis say, quote, no doubt future discoveries will continue to produce surprises and may cause historians to revise their theories on the timing and exact manner of Madagascar settlement. I mean, this is a really good example of this. So I then go on, this session finishes at 12, right? So, okay. So I then go on and look at a number of examples from East Africa. I basically read them, was looking at the most recent examples, what's been in the Zania and some other things. So I have a reference to I was also interested to point out that there's a piece in the 2012 reporting on the Ceilings Conference that Nikki's a key person that said, this is Peter Mitchell saying that if there was one overarching theme connecting the papers presented, it was the value, indeed the necessity, of interdisciplinary studies of East Africa's part in the Indian Ocean world. I say something that most of this would seem to be depending, according to what I'm seeing in the publications, on scientific work. And I give the example of this chemical analysis of carnelian beads from Gujarat, which had always depended just on visual things in West Africa and places like that. There's now been chemical analysis, which doesn't answer all the questions, but makes it a little more, the evidence more solid, to use, once again, picking up on Eric's term. But it seems to me, and that basic field work, which is sort of what Paul is really talking about here too, that basic field work and new thinking is what's opening up things. And I give a number of cases. I look at the report of the Ceilings group that was looking at food crops and exchanges in the hinterland of coastal Kenya that appeared in the Zania. I look at the work that Jeff Fleischer and Adria Laviolette have done on northern Pemba, to arguing that you didn't have to have concentrated urban sites with monumental buildings to have trade with the Indian Ocean. This is something quite different here. And then on Jeff, clearly influenced by this, Jeff's got this fascinating piece on exterior, kind of performance in exterior spaces, where he's looking at taking the map space of Sanjay Akati, which is in the same bay as Kiswani, and by basically walking the site and looking at the sight lines, sort of makes an argument about what might have occurred here, and then saying, well, there's no archaeological evidence for this, but how could we get to it? Let's see which case I have. Okay, so looking at that one, I was reading that paper, I was reminded of some other examples of performance in Swahilian coastal society that one could at least think about archaeologically. It might not be worth pursuing. One, for example, is the whole process of bull baiting in Pemba, which certainly has post-1500 origins. And Azania actually in 1980 reproduced a paper by the late Sir John Milner Gray that describes that. Another thing would be Grand Mariage, or Ada, in Ingazija. This is the thing, Ingazija is this 100% Muslim society, 100% matrilineal, in which people spend more money than you can imagine for the big, what's called big marriage. And it's a big public thing, although it's a marriage, it's a huge public affair. And there's lots of feasting that goes on, and so might there be something there? I thought, well, that's fun, but the best example that I think comes from Lamu. And I don't know if anybody's even looked at this, but I certainly hadn't seen anything. And this might offer some more concrete possibilities for archaeologists. According to the late Peter Lienhardt, who was nothing if not brilliant and quirky, he wrote in Tanganyika Notes and Records in 1959 that when the rains were late in Lamu, it was customary for the leading member of one lineage, the Makatibu, which is an interesting name in itself, of the oldest clan in Lamu, to perform a rainmaking ceremony. And I'm going to quote what he says. He sacrifices a bull, which is eaten at a communal meal. On the day before the sacrifice, a man goes round the town with a horn, asking each household to contribute to the cost of the bull and to prepare rounds of bread for the meal. And he doesn't say what kind of a horn, but I wonder if there's any connection to Siwas with their political meanings. The next day, the bull is led around the town. It's this circumambulation, starting from the Mono Lalo Mosque in the northern half, and then it is led outside the northern end of the town and sacrificed after prayers at a particular baobab tree. It is cooked and eaten there with the bread rounds, which may be of any grain, but are usually of rice or millet. And that's also interesting because rice is an imported crop originally, millet's an African crop. And then he says, the bones and inedible intestines are wrapped in the skin and buried in the ground near the tree. In the past, it was considered disastrous to bring any part of the animal back into the town. So my question, has anybody actually gone to see where this baobab is or was and looked to see if any of this stuff has been buried there? I mean, it strikes me as being, and even if they haven't, I just don't know about it, it strikes me as being an obvious clue. One should, there's something that one could look for. And it's a case where at least would seem to be some archaeological presence, even if it's only 1930, for evidence of what goes on in the what's called the built exterior. So I have a number of other things. Two things let me just finish with. Paul was mentioning, I was nodding, I have something here about Stefan Pradin's work and Thomas Vernet's sharp criticisms of it. But there's also room for historians, just to get away from archaeology, but for rereading certain kinds of sources that we all depend upon. I've already mentioned the Pericles one, and I need to find my example here. But there's, if you take a look at the Pericles, the early one that's available online, the Schaff translation of 1912, it refers to men of piratical habits on the coast. If you read Lionel Casson's translation, which everybody knows to be the best, it's a completely different translation of the Greek. Nothing about pirates. It's got a different reading of the political implications. And instead of there being chiefs, it's that everybody is like a chief, and basically talking about an acephalous society of some sort. And the other thing has to do, of course, with cinnamon, where Southeast Asianists have often read a passage in Pliny the Elder's natural history, where it talks about rafts and cinnamon. Some people have rather aggressively read this as must be double outrigger canoes, and the cinnamon must have come from Southeast Asia, and they will often, some people look at the findings in Terka for cinnamon. But the classical sources all make it clear that there are many varieties of cinnamon. The varieties of cinnamon in the classical period are all coming from either Somalia or from South Arabia. They're not Southeast Asian cinnamon. So it's easy, just little readings like that can really change things. The final thing that I'll mention here is something I'm doing that brings us to the historical period, which is I've been working on a different case study that so far doesn't involve archaeologists, and Richard Allen and I were just talking about some of this. We're working with Christian Kull, who's a Swiss geographer who's just recently moved to the ANU, and a French plant ecologist, Jacques Tassin, who's at the Center of International Cooperation and Agronomic Research for Development in Montpellier. We've been working on an article which is now called Marooned Plants, Vernacular Naming Practices in the Mascarene Islands. In this, there's a list, it's the Conservatoire Botanique National de Mascarene has a list of every plant they've got. So Tassin, who's been doing this work, has identified there are 114 plants so far that have got either marron or marron, that is maroon, as their final tag and their scientific name. The question, how does this come about and how did I get involved? Well, I've written about maroons in the Indian Ocean, so therefore put them together. So we first were looking at, did maroons bring these in, and we backed away from that while also coming to grips with the reality of maroon agency in changing things like eating habits particularly in Réunion, which is a much stronger tradition here. And to figure out how things were named. It turns out, of course, as probably some of you know, naming practices of plants, which are wildly different, are really very interesting. Drafting it was also interesting. It shows how technology works. Since I was on the West Coast, and Jacques was in Réunion or France, and Christian was in Australia. Once we started writing this, then we were basically writing 24 hours a day for about 10 days, because every time you'd open up your computer, there would be a new, a revised draft with somebody's input. What's interesting is that though we haven't done archival work, and there's only some that's available in the literature and some oral traditions, there are a lot of travelers' accounts, and there have been a number of amateur and professional ecologists who've looked at this, and there are very, very interesting ways in which these plants were used and what they would seem to substitute for. And I think what we're really hoping is that although archaeology has not been a part of this project, there certainly has been work on marronage and archaeology in Mauritius, and Chris knows about that. There hasn't been in Réunion. Richard and I took, this is just before we came over here this morning, he was being skeptical and saying, well, there's no built places, there's no forts or anything like that. And I was saying, yeah, but if you got somebody on the ground and it went around and collected oral traditions, and so somewhere in between there, it would be worth doing. I think the bottom line is that, to my knowledge, French, although there's been some very interesting archaeological work around the more obvious sites in Réunion, nobody's been looking at this. And I think there are probably political reasons for that as well as everything else. Réunion's an interesting place where the CP is still very powerful, and there's a strong, they're not called Pied Noir, but they're Petit Blanc area. It's a very interesting island that way. But I think there's something that's very possible there. So to conclude, I just want to emphasize that I think that just as archaeology was once called the handmaid of history, I finally tracked that down. It was the Lord Lytton's inaugural address to the British Archaeological Association in 1869, that both disciplines today find themselves engaged with an ever-expanding number of disciplines in the sciences, the arts, the humanities, and social sciences in their mutual efforts to understand the past and its meaning for the present. In the paper, I only give, and in this talk, a sample of the ways in which this kind of collaborative work has been used in Indian Ocean studies in the past. And I've only been looking in our Western Indian Ocean prejudice. I'm not an Africanist, is how looking at this end of the stick. But what stands out for me is both the continuing potential that this sort of research brings to our collective work and the always present caution that as we integrate these different sources of evidence and argument, we must be attentive to the methodological rules of each individual discipline. Just can't pick and choose as you want. Thank you very much.